is mentioned twice in this chapter. You'll see it there in verse 6 and again in verse 9. And it's mentioned a further 3 times in the rest of this particular chapter, this particular book, the 1st of Samuel. There's no mention of Samuel whatsoever, and it's predominantly, as we said, about God's dealings with the Philistines who took the ark. And it's more to do with a state of mind. And so it can provide us with great exhortation, it really can. So our objectives this evening are as follows. I've tried to categorise it into 5 digestible chunks for us. We're going to look at the mindset of both the Jews and the Philistines in regard to their attitude towards the ark. We're going to look at Dagon and its influences. I don't know if we know anything about Dagon, whether we've done studies on Dagon before, but it's really quite an interesting character, albeit he's an idol. Attitude to God of those around the ark and how that affected God's dealings with them. We'll look at the consequences that God outpoured upon those who took the ark and mistreated it. And we'll see if we can draw any lessons as by way of conclusion. So, as we mentioned, it's mentioned twice in this chapter. Now, the hand of the Lord, as a phrase, is quite unique. It's mentioned quite a lot in Scripture, but rarely, I suspect, understood. The hand part of this phrase comes from the Hebrew word yad, which is Strong's 3027, and it literally means a body part, a functional body part, something that you use to make something else happen. If you pick a cup up, you're making a movement using your hand, and that's the idea that the word is giving across, that it's a physical thing. It's not something that is mysterious or something like that. It's a physical thing. And then, of course, we have the Lord, and we know what that means. It means Yahweh. So, roughly translated, the term can be better rendered, hand of, I will be that I will be. And so that's an interesting phrase for us to think about, isn't it? When it's mentioned twice in this chapter alone. But it denotes a personal involvement in a matter. It gives the idea that somebody is in getting involved, working for a resolve, using a physical part. But what a terrifying position to be in if you're in the receiving end of this. If you're at the receiving end of the hand of the Lord, the Almighty, the All-Powerful, surely that must be a terrifying position to be in. And yet, David declared, I am in a great strait. Let us fall now into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hand of man. David, a man after God's own heart, would prefer to fall into the hand of God for judgment, because David had committed sin. And God presented him with certain choices, didn't he? How he could be punished for committing that sin. But David would rather choose to be dealt with by God. So that's got to be reassuring for us, hasn't it? David knew it was a very present source of help to him in a time of need. He took great comfort for the fact that he could call upon the name of God in his pain and in his anguish. We have Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 18 and verse 46. We did have that. And the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he girded him up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. And so he was a very present help to Elijah. So it wasn't a destructive force, it wasn't a corrective force, it was a help. And the help was there to help Elijah perform God's will. And we'll come to understand that the hand of the Lord is usually, well, predominantly always used to perform God's will, to enhance God's will upon the nations. So how do you become on the wrong side of the hand of the Lord? Well, we have a clue by Samuel himself. In the 1st of Samuel chapter 12 and verse 15. It says there, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then shall the hand of the Lord be against you, as it was against your fathers. So in other words, what he's saying is, if you hear the word and you do the word, the hand of the Lord won't be against you. It's as simple as that. Hear and obey. And that's what we do, isn't it? We come to the truth, we hear and we obey. We don't come to the truth, hear, and then sit down and do nothing. Or at least we shouldn't. We're proactive. We do things. We work for the truth. We hear and we do. We react to that to which we know to be true. But there are many examples where the hand of the Lord has been used to correct other nations. We think particularly of the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 9 and verse 3. Behold, the hand of the Lord is upon the cattle, which is in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. So God is using nature here to perform his will, to carry out his will. The hand of the Lord is against the animals, but for a purpose, to promote God's will and God's understanding to those around him. So he could teach the Egyptians that there was only one God, one true and living God, and that was the God of Israel. And so I think we can see there is a distinction being made. David saw the hand of the Lord for comfort. Elijah saw it for help. And it was used for punishment for Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 15. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them, to destroy them from among the host, until they were consumed. What's this about? Well, remember, don't we? The Jews in the wilderness, they were taken into the wilderness. They were taken out of Egypt and they were placed in the wilderness. But what did God declare? The men of war would not enter the land. Why? Because they hadn't been faithful. When they were instructed to go and to enter the land, they refused. There are giants in the land. We can't do it. In effect, they profaned God's name. They didn't go with what God wanted them to do. And so God declared that those men would not go into the promised land. Now this is interesting because that obviously covers a long period, doesn't it? It wasn't an instant judgment that God made. The judgment was made, but it was carried out over many, many years. And so we see another aspect to this hand of the Lord. It's not something that's instantaneous. It's something that God uses. Time is nothing to God. And so he uses this to tell the Jews that they must trust in him. But there's another reason why those men were not allowed to enter into the promised land. Because they were men of war, what would have happened when they entered the land and defeated the armies that confronted them? They would have said, we did that. We're soldiers. We were trained. And that's not what God wanted. That's not what God needs. God needs humility. God needs the respect that he was performing those things. They couldn't claim these things, these victories for themselves. They had to learn to trust in God. And so, as we expect, we begin to see this pattern unfolding, this purpose of the hand of the Lord revealed in all kinds of different ways. But ultimately, and this is the key, verse 24, that all people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. That's why God uses the hand of the Lord to correct. So that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. And that fear obviously develops into a wonderful love of the truth and the things concerning God. That's why these things happen. When the hand of the Lord is produced and used in circumstances, it is for that reason, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. What other features can we ascribe to the hand of the Lord? And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said unto the children of Reuben, and to the children of Gad, and to the children of Manasseh, this day we perceive that the Lord is amongst us, because ye have not committed these trespasses against the Lord. Now ye have delivered the children of Israel out of the hand of the Lord. So the hand of the Lord was set against them for evil. And yet because they repented, they were spared. And the acknowledgement is made there in Joshua chapter 22 and verse 31. That is a principle that can be established. God's will can be changed. It can be amended. If we are truly repentant, then God will spare those who have sinned. Another feature. Judges chapter 2 and 15, verse 15. Whithersoever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn unto them. And they were greatly distressed. So this time, the hand of the Lord was upon them, and it did punish them. It was for a reason, and the reason was to correct them, so they could walk the correct path which God had laid out for them. So let's just summarise some of the points that we've made. The hand of the Lord is used for protection, it's used for discipline, it's used for punishment, it's used for deliverance and comfort, and particularly in the case of David we saw there. But for our chapter, chapter 5, we're concerned with punishment, because that's what's going on in this chapter, chapter 5. God is going to punish the Philistines. He's already punished the Israelites. They were defeated. 2 great battles. They lost many, many men. So, God's judgment is going to come about through his mighty hand. And it's all to do with the ark. So what do we know about the ark? Well, let's just remind ourselves. I'm sure we know plenty of things, but let's just remind ourselves of a couple of points so we can focus our minds. The ark was carried by the priests in battle some 2,000 cubits in advance of the people and their army. 7 days it went round Jericho, didn't it, before the walls came tumbling down. The ark was always wrapped in a veil. It was 52 by 31 by 31 inches high, which really isn't very big, is it, in terms of boxes? And it was plated entirely with gold. But what we're really interested in is the mindset of the people that came into contact with this ark around that ark. What kind of mindset did they have in the way that they looked upon the ark? Because that's what caused the problems. That's why the ark left Shiloh, because of an attitude of mind that was contrary to that of God. So, in this chapter, chapter 5, we have a record of God's dealings with the Philistines and the ark, and a particular mindset. Now, what we need to try and establish is that there were 2 different camps. And when you have 2 different camps, you have 2 different opinions, don't you? We had the Israelites on one party. Both of them believed, the Israelites and the Philistines, both believed that this box contained some kind of supernatural power, that the box itself was miraculous, that it could perform when asked to. The Israelites felt that its presence with them in battle, like we saw 2,000 cubits in advance, would ensure them victory. They thought these things to be true. They treated it as a lucky charm. But in effect, what the Israelites were trying to do was to force God's hand. They hadn't lived God-fearing lives. They hadn't tried to do their best. They weren't reading their scriptures. They weren't doing the things required of them by the law. Now, we can do that as well, can't we? It's like us putting our Bibles on the shelves or on the side cabinet and only really getting it out when we need it, when we need reassurance, when we need that comforting verse that we know is in there, and then we go and find it and we're reassured. And that can happen to all of us, can't it? But the other camp, the Philistines, well, they feared the box, didn't they? They were petrified that this box had come in to the Israelite camp, that they had presented it at Ebenezer. They'd gone and taken it out of Shiloh, and they'd brought it. This meant certain doom, surely. So they feared the box. So we got one party being overjoyed to see the box, and the other party being fearful of the box. But God wasn't in the box. They'd missed the point. God had left them. That's why they'd lost the battles. Whether they'd had the ark or not, it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have made any difference. God was not in the box. It was a box overlaid with gold. That's what God saw it as. That's what it was. The Israelites knew of the priests. They would have remembered the priests had something to do with the ark. They would have remembered perhaps the marching around Jericho. They would have remembered the parting of the Jordan. These things would have been distant memories for them, I'm sure. They wouldn't have been focused and right at the forefront of their mind. So they would have thought, yes, we need to go and get the ark from the priests. We know that's good for a reason. And so they bring it into battle. And what happens? It's taken. It's taken by the Philistines. Because their faith was in a box. They worshipped the box, not the God whom they had forgotten. There was no confession at all, or repentance. No thought of it. There was no, oh Lord God, we've sinned, now help us in battle. None of that. They just wanted their ends met. They wanted to win this battle. We are Abraham's seed, would have been the cry. We will be saved because God promised to Abraham that he would do these things. We need not worry. And look what happened. Their faith was misplaced. It was misguided. So what we have now is a situation where the Philistines believe they have the upper hand. They've got the ark, they captured it at Ebenezer, and now they've taken it to Ashdod. Woohoo! They're in control. They've took the enemy's deity. Now, in olden times, that act of taking the enemy's deity was considered magnificent. If you've caught the enemy's deity, that's ensured their complete and utter destruction. And that was the mindset that not only the Philistines had, but all the other nations around them. If you could capture the God, then you've captured the nation. And that God would then favour you rather than that nation. That was a mindset. And that's a mindset that's particularly hard to get out of. They believed that capturing the deity was the best thing that could happen. And it was probably based on good reasoning. Because if you think about it, if you're imagine yourself as a Philistine at the moment, some of us probably are, their previous successes that they'd had, they would have took the gods and then returned and added them to their own gods. They would have felt empowered. They would have felt that these things were the right thing to do. So each conquest would have added to that theory, wouldn't it? They would have become more and more proud, more and more boastful. But that's not what was happening, because God was controlling the situation. God was building these nations up, the Philistines and all the other nations, for a purpose, that he could use them to discipline his people, to correct his people in measure. And so they were completely wrong, because God isn't an idol. He's a living God. And they make a massive mistake. They take him to Ashdod. Now Ashdod, why Ashdod? Well, Ashdod, we'll have a look in a moment, was on the coast. But before we go there, I've just missed a point. The Israelites had succumbed also to this mentality. You see, they were looking at the at the Philistines and thinking to themselves, well, the Philistines are taking all these nations, they're getting all this wealth from the nations that they're taking, and yet we're not. And yet God said we could have all this land. So they'd be looking at them with a jealous eye, thinking, what are we doing? Perhaps we ought to do this. Perhaps that may have been the motivation for them bringing the ark into Ebenezer in the first place. We'll bring our God. They're bringing theirs. We'll bring ours. Our God's more powerful. But of course they were wrong. They wanted to be like the nations round about them. And that manifested itself a bit later on, didn't it? When the cry went out, give us a king, so we can be like the nations round about us. That's not too far down into the distant future. That cry goes out. What did Solomon say? 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 27. Don't turn up. I'll read this out for you. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and the heavens of heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house that I have builded? How much less this 31-inch high box? Solomon knew what was going on, but they put their faith in this box. The box had no power of itself, and God was never ever going to allow the Israelites to defeat the Philistines just because they had the ark. That was never ever going to happen, and if they thought that, they would have been completely misguided. So this is where we are now. The ark in Philistra. The Philistines think that their victory over the Israelites vindicates them and shows them that their God, Dagon, is the supreme God. He's superior to the God of Israel. And they bring the ark into Dagon. And Dagon's temple is down here in Ashdod. So they bring it all the way down there, across the land, pretty much flat land, and they deposit it in the temple of Dagon. Now, before we go any further, we just need to remind ourselves who the Philistines are so we can really get into their mindset. The Philistines seem to have come over from the Aegean Sea, and they bordered on the coastal areas down here, and they made 5 cities. They adopted the Canaanite language, proper names, and they adopted the gods, the local gods as well, because they came and they saw that the land was fruitful. So they assumed in their minds that these gods that were already here were the right gods, because the land was fruitful. It was a land flowing with milk and honey, wasn't it? Why did they need to bring their own gods? The gods here were doing a great job. So they assimilated them. They took them for their own. And the more gods, the better, because then they felt that they were in control. They were also very skilled at pottery and metalwork, and that'll come into focus in a moment. But Ashdod and Ekron were the 2 most northerly cities there. Why they went to Ashdod rather than Ekron? Possibly because Ashdod, I suspect, might have been one of the first cities that they built, so it would have been more densely populated. There was certainly a big temple there to Dagon, and obviously when they captured the god of the Israelites, they wanted to demonstrate to the people that this is an offering to our god, Dagon. We're going to put it in that temple. And so that's where they put it. I suspect the fact that Dagon was classed as a fish god initially would also place him near the sea. So that's probably why they kept him there. And so it was near the coast. Now, there's a number of deities that the Philistines worshipped. I've picked 3, the most popular ones. We have Baal, Astarte, or Ashtaroth, as the Hebrews call her, and Dagon. Baal was a god of the rain, a god of the thunder, fertility and agriculture. But as I say, a lot of this is crossed over. We see that Astarte was also connected with fertility, sexuality and war. And then we have Dagon, who was a god of fish initially, but there's historical evidence to show now that he was also a god of grain. And I suspect that developed through the Philistine reign. And I'll try and elaborate on that in a couple of moments. But Dagon was originally an Assyrio-Babylonian fertility god. That's where he came from. So they just assimilated him into their beliefs. But he did develop into their main god. Don't know why. Perhaps they won more battles with Dagon as their god than they did with Astarte or Baal. I'm not sure. But he was also known from early Bronze Age Mesopotamia and northern Syrian, I'm reading this as you can probably tell, Syrian cities. The Philistines apparently adopted him as their principal god soon after they arrived in Canaan. So pretty soon after they arrived here, the battles that they fought, they soon realised that Dagon was the best god for them. Just to elaborate on that point and to confirm it really, when we read of Samson, when the Philistines captured Samson, this is recorded. Then the lords of the Philistines gathered themselves together to offer a great sacrifice unto Dagon their god, and to rejoice, for they said, our God hath delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. So we've got their God, our God. It belonged to them. It was their chief god. That's the one that they praised for delivering Samson into their hands. I've already done that one, so we'll move straight on for that. Right, verse 2 of our chapter. We read there, when the Philistines took the ark, they brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. 2 interesting words there, brought and set it by. Brought, the Hebrew word denotes a kind of bowing, a presenting. It's the same word that is used in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 19, when God presents all of creation to Adam and says, name them. That's the kind of thing that the word is trying to get across. It's a presentation. Here you go, do what you want with it. And that's basically what God said to Adam, name them what you want. So that's the idea. They brought it, they presented it, almost as an offering to their god, Dagon. But it denotes for a purpose. It was done for a reason. And the reason was they wanted to display, they wanted to mock the God of Israel, because their god Dagon had defeated him. That's how they saw it. That was the mindset that they had. Set it by. That denotes more or less what it says. It's almost borders on a permanent fixture. So they'd put it beside Dagon and they'd set it, almost hammered it in, if you like. So the intention was that the people could come and look at this and compare it and say, yes, look, Dagon is mightier than the God of Israel. But that's where they made the mistake. Because now it wasn't between the Philistines and the Israelites. They'd made it personal. It was now between God and the Philistines, God and Dagon. There's no way that God is going to be humiliated by a stone figure carved by human hands. That was the mistake. You see, the superstition that they had about this box caused them to see the box as a god. And so they thought, yes, we'll add it to our collection of gods. But now, God was going to teach them a lesson. Yes, says God, I let you defeat my people. Yes, I let you carry away this box. But to be insulted personally by you and your false gods, that's not going to happen. God draws the line. He says, no more. I let those things happen, says God, because I intend to correct my people. I am using you as an instrument to correct my people. I will demonstrate to you, says God, using your false worship, just who is the true God, just as I did to the Egyptians. And of course, they would have remembered what happened to the Egyptians. If you flick over the page to chapter 6 and verse 6, it's recounted there for us. They knew only too well, even though they had to go to the Lord to find out. Wherefore, ye shall make images of your emerods and images of your mice that you... Sorry, that's verse 5. Wherefore then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and the Pharaohs hardened their hearts, when he had wrought wonderful things among them? Did they not let the people go and they departed? So they knew about these things, but they just dismissed them. Perhaps just as a battle conveniently won. So what do we know about Dagon? We need to understand what Dagon represented to their minds so we can understand what happens next. I'll go very quickly through these because we've dealt with most of this. He was Babylonian fertility god. He was adopted by the Philistines. He wasn't invented by them. It's an interesting one. The first of Chronicles chapter 10 verse 8, we learn that King Saul's head was displayed in the temple of Dagon. That's interesting, isn't it? Perhaps that event in itself could be a throwback to what's happening in this chapter. The fact that Dagon's head comes off in verse 3. Perhaps that's a retaliation by the Philistines. We'll stick your king's head in our temple. They still hadn't learnt after all those years. Dagon was known primarily as a fish god, but then later developed into a god of grain. So he was a multitasking god, if you like. Now, grain, that's important. The reason it's important is because, and I didn't know this, so this was a revelation to me, the Philistines were very heavy drinkers. They were skilled in pottery making and they were skilled in metalwork. The kind of skills that they needed to make drinking implements. And out of all the artifacts that they find in Philistine ruins are predominantly these mugs that they made to drink their vast quantities of alcohol. Think of Samson's wedding. What happened? They had week-long drinking feasts, didn't they? They went on all week. They loved their drink. What do you need to make drink? They needed the grain. That's why they tried to move further and further inland, because the land was so good for growing grain. They turned that grain into alcohol, drank it, got drunk. Very interesting. This is what Wikipedia says about it. The Philistines were also renowned for both their production and consumption of alcoholic beverages. They weren't that renowned because I didn't know anything about it. Numerous finds have exposed a well-managed spirits industry wait for it, from breweries and wineries to retail outlets that advertised beer, wine, and advertised strong drink. Amongst the most numerous artefacts unearthed from Philistine ruins, which we've just mentioned, are beer mugs and wine craters, large drinking bowls. That's what they love to do. After a good day's slaying in the battle, they'd come home and get drunk. It seemed to be the sum of their life, and as long as the gods were approving and they were still winning battles, why change? Verse 3. This then is an anomaly. I don't understand verse 3 fully, if that's the case. See if you can help me out with this. And when they of Ashdod arose early on the morrow, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord, and they took Dagon and set him back in his place. The bit that confuses me is that they rose early. The night before, they'd just been celebrating all night, drinking alcohol, getting merry. Then they arise early. Doesn't quite ring true, does it? So something's not quite right. I've never had a hangover, so I don't know if I could wake up early in the morning or not. I assume, and I have been told reliably, that if you get drunk the night before, you tend not to wake up early in the morning. Am I right?
Yeah.
Oh, very good, very good. You may have your own thoughts on this, but the only conclusion that I could come to is perhaps that there was some external event. Now, it says there, verse 3, that he was fallen upon his face. This is where we have to start putting our CSI hat on and doing a bit of detective work, because we look at the key words here. It says fallen. What it doesn't say is that he was pushed. Has anybody seen the film Raiders of the Lost Ark? Yes, a number of you. The ark is open, what happens? Lots of spirits and angel type figures come out, don't they? Kill everybody, consume everything, knock the tables over, the lights and everything. A complete devastation. That's what happens in the film, isn't it? That's most people's understanding, I expect, of what happens when the ark is opened. I think the fact that it's recorded here that Dagon fell tells us something different. You see, God uses nature. We know from talks that Brother Don's given a talk on stormy wind fulfilling God's word. We know God uses nature. And we'll see that through the rest of our remarks. God uses nature to perform his will. Now, the fact that it fell implies to me, coupled with the fact, by the way, that they arose early, tells me that there was some external force that made this happen. That affected not just the temple where Dagon came down, but everywhere else. In other words, a kind of a shaking of the earth, perhaps an earthquake. Mild it may have been, but enough to wake them up and topple Dagon. Why else would they wake up and rush to the temple to look at Dagon early in the morning? They'd woke up because of the earth being shook. They'd remembered that they'd put the ark in with Dagon, and they were so obsessed with their chief god Dagon, they ran to Dagon to see how he was. And where is he? He's lying face down in front of the ark. It's fascinating, isn't it? God uses nature. That provides an explanation for me, in my mind anyway, having sort of troubled over this for quite some time, of why they awoke early out of a drunken stupor and stumbled probably towards the temple to check on Dagon. That word fallen as well is the same word used when the walls of Jericho fell down, when they marched round and sounded the trumpets and the walls came tumbling down. That is the same word used, fallen. An external force. We also have the idea in this particular incident of a basement. Now, I don't mean a basement below a building where you store your alcohol, but a basement, denying oneself, what are the words I can use for this? To lower your own rank and to esteem somebody else greater than you. And that's what was happening here. The Dagon image had fallen down on his face. A scriptural principle comes into mind, doesn't it? That when we're confronted with the living God, or the living God's representative, what's the first thing that people do? They fall to their knees. They don't want to look up. And that's what God was telling them that they should be doing. You should be doing what this image is now doing. Bowing down to me, because I am the living God. So, face down. Obedience, humbleness, subjection. That's what was happening. You notice there in verse 2 it says that it was the ark of God that was brought into the temple of Dagon, wasn't it? But look at the next verse, verse 3. It's now the ark of the Lord, the ark of Yahweh, the ark of I will be that I will be. It's personal. If we needed any more proof, that's the proof. It's now personal between God and Dagon and God and the Philistines. He was going to demonstrate to them his almighty power. Verse 3 and 4, we have different words for the word earth there. He said it's fallen upon his face to the earth. And then in verse 4 it says ground. It's actually the same word. It's just the translators have decided to use different words for some reason. But that word, and this is absolutely fascinating when I picked up on this, brothers and sisters. That word, earth, is the same word that is used in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17. What happened in Genesis chapter 3 verse 17? God says to Abraham, look at the land. That is what I'm going to give you. It's yours to possess. What has happened here? This was Abraham's land, promised to Abraham. God gave this land to Abraham for a possession. Come with me to Joshua chapter 15 and verse 20. I found this absolutely fascinating, brothers and sisters. Finding things out like this just really excite me. Joshua chapter 15 and verse 20, we read, this is the inheritance of the tribe of the children of Judah according to their families. And then we have a whole list of names, don't we? But scroll down to verse 41. What do we read there? And Gederoth and Beth Dagon. This very place where they had put this temple was allotted to the tribe of Judah. It belonged to Judah. They shouldn't be there. They were imposters. It was given to the Jews. God made the declaration to Abraham. And now this stone god was trying to defy that very promise that God had made to his people. No false god will stand in the way of God's righteous judgment and God's promises that he has made. And so the Philistines had to be humbled. And so the idol that they put their faith and put their trust in was to be reckoned with. And so we see in verse 4, they go back in. Verse 3, sorry. They go back in and they refasten it. They probably spent all day in a hangover state putting it back up. And no doubt they then went and had another binge drink to celebrate that they managed to get it back up in a day. They go to bed. And then what happens in verse 4? And when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head and both the palms of the hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. The same thing had happened, and I suspect it was another earthquake. And they arose early and thought, oh no, not again. They rush in, and there he is on the floor. But this time, it's fatal. No hands, no head. What do? They only just managed to get it up in a day. How are they going to reattach the head and the arms? No, there's significance in what happened here. You see, they still were in denial. They still believed that the more gods they had, the better. They couldn't accept that there was one God. One God that deals with the affairs of mankind. So, the hand of Dagon is off. The hand of God has succeeded over this idol. And yet they still wanted to believe. But what did God decree? What was the first commandment given to the Israelites? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. What had they done? What had the Philistines done? They put the God beside him, before him, as an equal. And God is saying no. No way. And so the idol is destroyed. And what's interesting, brothers and sisters, is that the fish part remains. That's not damaged at all. It's the part that represents man. The hands, the head, the doing, the thinking. That's what was destroyed. God has an issue with man when he tries to usurp himself over God. The next morning, the hands and the heads were removed. The symbology is simply this. God has a problem with man who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, all that is worshipped, so that he is as God, sitteth at the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4. That's what they were doing. Our God is human form, and it's better than you. You're just a box. So God corrects them in measure. Just an aside, brothers and sisters. Did you notice the hat there? This is on so many images on the internet of Dagon. If you type in Dagon and have a look, they've nearly all got some form of hat like that. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to put a picture up that... Well, here we go. That phrase that we've just come across there. Look at the hat. Look how it's developed over the years. Why have they done this? Why have the Catholics chosen to wear a head covering anyway? And then to make it fish-like. Direct opposition to God. This Dagon image that put himself as an equal against God. Why have they done that? It's fascinating, isn't it? When we look at these things. And that's over many centuries that's developed. And to the point where we have down there. It's so obvious that it's fish-shaped. There's many, many other images as well that I could have showed you, but just would have took loads and loads of time. So, what's significant about the head and the hands? We've digressed a little bit. What's significant about the head and the hands? The head, knowledge. The head dictates what the body does, what the hands do. It controls everything. It controls the direction that we go in, doesn't it? It controls the rest of the body. It reasons, it considers, and it evaluates. But when it elevates itself to above God, then it is blaspheming God. They knew of God. We've read of that. Chapter 6, verse 6, the Egyptians, they knew about it, although it was in their distant past and they had to go to the laws to recall it, they did know about it. This idol with a man's head and features was in direct opposition to God. That's why it had to be destroyed. The declaration that God alone rules in the kingdoms of men. The Philistines had chosen to ignore this. The hand of God. The hand represents the doing, doesn't it? The physical work. The working for the Lord. But now, Dagon was left prostrate on the floor. No head, no hands. This simple stone structure couldn't even lift itself off the ground and reposition itself. And how come the Philistines couldn't see that? That they were the ones that were putting it back up. They were the ones that were going to have to reattach the head and the arms. This was not a God that could do anything. They've already seen how God can shake the earth. How God can destroy their temple and their God. And it was lost on them. Their mindset had been so focused. And you can see almost why God instructed the Israelites when they defeated them to defeat the lot. Women, children, cattle, everything. Get rid of it. It's an abomination. So this idol then could do nothing of itself. It couldn't even pick itself up off the floor. It was broken in pieces, just like Nebuchadnezzar's image would be later on. Just a little aside here, I don't want to dwell too long on this. They could have destroyed the ark, couldn't they? Instead of bringing it back, they could have destroyed it. But such was the strength of their conviction that they really felt that this would be a suitable addition to their gods and it would help them promote themselves and emulate themselves in the land. But they could have destroyed it. They never ever did that. They only ever added to their gods. And that's been the view of many civilizations throughout history. And really, if we think back to Jesus' time, to Paul's time in particular, walking in Athens, and he sees the unknown God, the devotion to the unknown God. Exactly the same principle. They wanted as many gods as they could have, so they didn't offend anybody, any god that they'd left out. So that mentality had gone all through history. And yet the Jews were content with one God. They knew that their salvation lay with Yahweh. God says, I am the only true God. Right, as a sign then, Dagon, destroyed, could do nothing for himself. He couldn't communicate with them, got no head, got no voice. He couldn't deliver them, got no hands. He was useless now. And really that reminds us of what we're like. We can do nothing of ourselves, can we? We are totally reliant on God. Now the threshold we read of there in verse 5. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread upon the threshold of Dagon and to Ashdod unto this day. I'll be totally honest with you, and sisters, I don't really understand this. I found an obscure reference in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 9, where it says that God threatens to punish those who imitate this act, speaking of the Jews. So it was apparent that at some point the Jews were imitating this act of not stepping over the threshold. I don't know why they were doing that, and I can't find any other reference at all. In my mind, I can only think that it was a barrier that you don't cross over. You don't go to the idol. You stay with God. But it was a Philistine tradition, and obviously the Philistines did lots of silly things. So, verse 6. But, and here's our phrase for the first time, the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them and smote them with emerods. Even Ashdod and the coasts thereof. The hand of the Lord smote them with emerods. Most dictionaries, most commentaries will have us believe that this is piles. Now I know this isn't a very savoury subject, but they tell us that it's piles because of an obscure verse in one of the Psalms that says he afflicted them in their hinder parts, which was actually the reading we were going to have. It's if you want to have a look at it, it's Psalm 78 verse 54 to 66, where it's talking about this event and it mentions the hinder parts. I've actually got a different view. I subscribe to a view which I did pick up on a commentary, so it's not my own idea, but the suggestion is that these are boils, and these are boils that are related to the bubonic plague. Now, I say that because of a number of points. There was a lot of mice in the area. Remember, the Philistines were heavy drinkers. They grew a lot of grain, didn't they? What does grain attract? Mice. Mice can carry a particular flea. And this is how the bubonic plague is spread. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second. I want to play you a tiny video. I don't know if you'll be able to see this because it's quite dark. Just to give you... Oh,
of biblical proportions.
Don't know if you can hear this.
Is a plague of biblical proportions.
To be in the middle of a mouse plague is a surreal experience. They were everywhere. The ground's moving, they're going in all directions.
You could see down the front of our house, the ground was just moving. It was just moss.
The locals can't leave their homes. If they drive, they risk skidding off the road. Farmers don't want to go into their barns.
The ground's moving, the walls are moving, things are running on rafters, they're going in all directions. I've had a few go up my trouser leg. It's not a good feeling.
There is no refuge from the plague.
That's just to give
anywhere.
you an idea of what it could have been like. Okay, they would have had massive grain houses where they kept all this grain. So, the bubonic plague comes along. Remember, God uses nature, doesn't he? We've established that in many, many talks and hopefully reinforced that this evening as well. I believe that God created then the correct conditions for this particular mite which infects the lymph nodes of humans, which attaches itself to the mouse. Predominantly the mouse, it also does it to rats as well, but predominantly mice. And then That is the result. That's what happens. That is the bubonic plague. Now that to me is very close to what we're reading of here. And it also makes sense because most people that are infected with the bubonic plague, apparently 2/3 of those infected die within 4 days. So there's a massive mortality rate with this thing. Piles, I don't know anybody that's died of piles. I may be wrong. But this seems more logical to me, particularly with the reference to mice. The reference to mice isn't mentioned in this particular chapter. We pick up on that in chapter 6, where they're told by the elders to put the golden mice in, one for each of the elders. So it's a bit of an obscure reference, but I believe that that's exactly what happened. That God caused the correct temperature and the weather conditions for these mites. And we know that it's a very delicate thing, isn't it, for a lot of insects. If the weather's wrong, they just die. But if the conditions are right and rife, then there's an explosion. And these things come to life. And I believe that that's exactly what happened here. And it's ironic, isn't it, that ultimately it was their lifestyle that destroyed them. The things that they chose to do. They wanted to be heavy drinkers. So as a result of that, God uses the natural surroundings around them to destroy them. I think it's quite remarkable. I think there's an obvious exhortation there for us as well, because it's the same as us. If we eat too much, we put on weight. If we smoke too much, there's the possibility we can get cancer. We know.
Now there's an obvious exhortation here, isn't there, brothers and sisters? If we choose to dwell in the world, we will become like the world. We are products of our environment that we choose to dwell in. If we choose to dwell in the world, we will become like the world. If we choose to dwell in the house of God, we will become more Christ-like. And so in verse 7 we read, "And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, The ark of God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us, and upon Dagon our God." So still, faced with the obvious truth that God was the cause of these dramatic events, they still choose Dagon over the living God. Think of the Gadarenes in Jesus' time, when they had lost their swine, when Jesus cast out legion into the swine, and they ran down the hill. What did they desire? Of the Saviour of the world. "Depart! Depart from our coasts," they demanded. "We don't want to hear your message. You're too much trouble. You prick our consciences." And that very same attitude of mind was being displayed here by the Philistines. They still thought that the Lord God was against their god Dagon. But he wasn't. He was against them. He was against them for their unbelief. They still thought the box was causing the problems. So what do? Verse 8. "They sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines unto them and said, What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, Let the ark of the God of Israel be carried unto Gath. And they carried the ark of God of Israel, the ark of the God of Israel about thither." So, under the guidance of the lords, the princes, and this word in Hebrew actually gives the idea of a hinge, an opening, something that opens a door, one way or another, a choice. So what does the hinge do? What is their advice? What is their recommendation? Send it away. Exactly the same attitude that we have with the Gadarenes. Send it away. We don't want it. We don't need it. But what's happening at Gath? Well, nothing yet. But verse 9. "And it was so, that after they had carried it about, the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great destruction. And he smote the men of the city," and look at this, "both small and great." Small men and great men. Who came from Gath? That's right. Goliath came from Gath. That one who defied the armies of the living God, who stood in front of them and said, "Bring it on. Give it your best shot. I am Goliath of the Philistines, and I will not be defeated." The pride and the arrogance that he showed was being demonstrated here, now, in this city. Send it to us. It's not a problem for us. We've got giants in our land. You may not have been able to deal with it, but we can. Send it to us. Their pride and their arrogance was to come before a great fall. Verse 10. Therefore they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And it came to pass, as the ark of God came to Ekron, that the Ekronites cried out, saying, They have brought about the ark of God of Israel to us, to slay us and our people. Notice what has happened. They don't consult the Lord this time. No messing about. Their pride and their arrogance just want it gone. Get it out. Hush, hush. Let's send it north again. And so they do. They send it to the most northern city. But remarkably, this too was a city that should have been under Judah's rule, because they had taken it by the mighty hand of the Lord in Judges chapter 1 and verse 18. But at some point in the future, through lack of faith, they had lost it. And now the Ekronites were dwelling in this land that God had given them. There was no consultation this time. The ark is just gone. Take it to the Ekronites. But now we have infighting. The Philistines are turning in on themselves. What a dramatic situation. At one point, they should have been happy to see the ark. They brought it down, didn't they? And they were going to display it in their temple. Look, our God has had victory over the God of Israel. But now the ark is like a hot potato, passing it from hand to hand. They can't get rid of it quick enough. They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people. But they still wouldn't submit to God and what He wanted from them. They'd had the lesson. The idol was made to bow down before the Lord God of Israel. Not quite the reaction that they hoped for, was it? They really ought to have been parading it through the cities as a trophy, just as the footballers do when they win a major trophy. But instead they were parading it now as an instrument of death. And the ark had been amongst them for 7 months. It has taken them this amount of time to realise that God was in control and not Dagon. It was God that was all powerful. It was God that could make things happen. And yet they refused to bow down to Him, as requested by the obvious sign of when Dagon was forced to fall prostrate before him. And so they suffered the death. But God did spare some of them in verse 12. And the men that died not were smitten with the emerods, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. And so they were presumably left to be able to recount the affair, lest they forget. And that's probably how the tradition of the threshold, not crossing the threshold, came into existence. And so we saw, didn't we, in chapter 4, how the Israelites tried to manipulate God by forcing Him to come into battle with them and to give them the victory. And we've seen in chapter 5 how the Philistines tried to manipulate God, to incorporate Him into their beliefs. But both failed. And they failed because God will not be mocked. The lesson that must be learned is that we must learn to follow God and His ways, and not expect Him to follow us in the adventures that we have in our lives, and then expect Him to be there and pick up the pieces when things go wrong. The Israelites, if they had learned this lesson, then perhaps they would have been humble, and perhaps they would have followed the Lord God. But no, in a few years' time the cry would go up, "Give us a king. We want to be like the nations round about us." They should have remained separate, shouldn't they, to that one God who rules in the kingdoms of men. And that was so clearly demonstrated in God's dealings with the Philistines. But they couldn't see it. And so that cry went out, "Give us a king." I'm going to leave you, brothers and sisters, with this verse, which should be a comfort to all of us. The 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6. "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time." Thank you.